In South Africa, we're a water scarce country. We have very little surplus water, and we have significant challenges in that our power generation, which is primarily thermal power generation, coal-fired power generation, takes place in the same area where the coal is mined, largely, which is in one of the most important watershed areas of the country. So it's where the rainfall is fairly high. And so it's an important source of water for the country, but unfortunately it's also in catchments that are in fact already overstressed, where the demand is exceeding the supply. So although in South Africa power generation only uses 2% of the water used entirely, it uses it in a very significant area. And so the water use itself is important in terms of managing our water budget. But the other problem that we have, which is a very critical issue in terms of thermal power generation, is the impacts of mining coal on water. And that unfortunately is an impact that lives with you even after power stations have been decommissioned, because you have mines that you have to deal with. We have an enormous number of decommissioned mines that were not properly decommissioned because they came to an end before modern environmental legislation was in place. So we have a real problem with acid mine drainage that is polluting our water. So there are two sides to the coin. There's the water quality issue from the coal mining, and then there's the issue of the actual use by the power stations. South African water law and policy has been considered to be like amongst the best in developing countries. It's quoted all around the world. Essentially, our policy manages on a catchment basis or watershed basis, and it has all the right statements around managing both abstraction and discharge in order to protect our aquatic ecosystems. We have a constitution that ensures that people, or that states, that people are entitled to a safe environment, an environment that is not harmful to health or well-being, sufficient water, etc. It all looks good on paper. In terms of implementation, I think there are a number of things that we've struggled with, which I think might well be useful for India. The one is that we've had limited financial and human resources for implementing. I think we became overambitious in terms of some of the procedures that we developed for implementation. So instead of kind of the Volkswagen, we invented the Rolls-Royce, and it never even got out of the starting blocks in some ways. So we've made it difficult for ourselves to actually implement. And I think part of the lesson for us is that you need to take it in stages. Is start by implementing what is most critical at this point. Simply get that done. Stop trying to do everything perfectly in one go. And that's not to say that we haven't got regulation in place and we haven't got some controls. So all our power stations have either what is called an existing use, lawful use to use water, or a license to use water, which stipulates how much water they may use. The coal mines have the same in terms of how much water they can use. They also have water quality controls in terms of what water they're allowed to discharge. The challenge comes if mines are not complying. We haven't been very good on the monitoring and then actually taking people to court and getting the court cases to hold. India's water management is so complicated, not least by the fact that you have water sits as a state function and not as a national function. So in South Africa, we took a conscious decision because our water is unevenly divided across the country, and we decided water was going to be national. We weren't going to allow states to hold other states to ransom, as it were, in terms of water. So we have the power of water management sits at the national level. You have this complexity that you have water sitting at a state function. So it depends on what the states decide to do and how they decide to handle it. And that makes it much more complicated than one national department. And so I think it varies from state to state how well India is doing in relation to water management. Andhra Pradesh, I think, has done some interesting stuff around their water legislation, and I can't claim to be a great expert on Indian water legislation, but I think that it varies from state to state how it's been doing. It's going to be an increasing challenge with climate change. We're seeing all over Africa climate change already impacting on climate variability with greater droughts. In Africa, there's been a large swing to hydropower, which might be clean energy and whatever, but also is very vulnerable to the issue of drought, in the same way that thermal power stations are vulnerable to not having water. I think there are a number of options. It depends on whether you can actually create further water infrastructure that will actually build a greater assurance of supply for those power stations. I think we have to diversify power options and try and look at ones that actually aren't so dependent on water in places that are water scarce. It may be that one transports power from areas where there is sufficient water. It may be that you look at non-water dependent solutions in those areas. I think there are various options you have to look at. One of the things that is interesting in the South African approach is when we allocate water to different sectors, we allocate a different assurance of supply. So in a particular water system, farmers, for example, can expect that they will get their water, their full quota, probably 70% of the time. Eskom, which is our national electricity supplier, gets their assurance of supply is 99.5%. So everything going according to plan, which it doesn't always, but everything going to a plan, Eskom should only be facing water shortage 1 in 200 years. And that is specifically because we've said that, in fact, in terms of keeping the economy going, it is most important that you keep the electricity supply going, and we're entirely dependent on coal-fired power stations. If you look at the water supply that feeds Eskom, it is an enormously complicated system of interbasin transfers between dams, so we can move water around and pump it back upstream to actually ensure that Eskom has sufficient water. And that's the kind of thing that one has to be able to look at. That plus the whole technology around using dry cooling, etc. So there are various options that I think one then has to look at in order to. But where you've got existing power stations, you then have to look at, is it the best option to find enough water to keep them going, or to actually replace them with some alternative?